Welcome to the latest webinar in the Researching the Far Right Methods and Ethics series, a collaboration between the Center for Research on Extremism, CREX, the University of Oslo, the Reactionary Politics Research Network at Bath, and the Center for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities at Lancaster. In this series, based on the volume, The Ethics of Researching the Far Right, Critical Approaches and Reflections, Manchester University Press, edited by Antonio Vaughan, Joan Braun, Megan Tinsley, and Aurelian Mondon, we explore and discuss researching the far right from a more critical and politically engaged perspective. Today's webinar is Researching the Far Right, Positionality, Standpoint, and Intersectionality with Ray Jereza, Elsa Bengtson-Mueller, and Imo Kaufman. The webinar will focus on the themes and issues in part 2 of the book, Ethics of Researching the Far Right, most notably on how the positionality and standpoint of researchers can impact not only the field, but on wider society. Challenging some of positive approaches which have placed the researcher above their research, as if social sciences can be conducted in the same manner as the hard sciences. The authors presenting here argue that our striving for conducting impartial research must start with a clear engagement with our own positionality, but also take into account the wider state of play and norms which may invisibilize certain patterns and structures of oppression, including racism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, and ablism, as well as the intersections between them. This is also important to understanding why we need to challenge more recent and progressive interventions which focus on researcher risk, but treat the researcher not only as objective and outside research, but instead as a universal subject and potentially equally vulnerable in the face of the far right and institutions of power. The contributions will look at and reflect on these issues in relation to the politics of the field, research methods, and crucially, researcher identities and experiences. My name is Aaron Winter. I'm both a contributor to that section of the book and moderating this event. To introduce the speakers, our first speaker will be Ray Jereza, is a senior researcher at Frameworks. They are an anthropologist whose academic research focuses on digital labor, far-right politics, and discourse on online racism in the US. Prior to joining Frameworks, they taught anthropology and served as a senior researcher at the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, PERIL, and a research assistant professor at American University. Jereza received their BA in Sociology and History from Muhlenberg College in Sociology and a PhD in Anthropology from Bingham University, SUNY. Our second speaker, Ella Bengtson-Mueller, is a PhD candidate at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Goldsmiths, University of London, and a lecturer at University of Southampton. Mueller holds an MSc in Comparative Political Thought and a BA in Politics from SOAS. Mueller's research focuses on misogyny, online gender-based violence, and anti-feminist and male supremacist extremism, and explores feminist theory and approaches to the politics of cyberspace. In their doctoral research, Mueller develops a feminist methodology for researching anti-feminist online cultures through the use and theorizations of emotions and affect. Our third and final speaker will be Imo Kaufman, a PhD student at University of Nottingham. Their project is in collaboration with the National Video Game Museum and explores the lived experience of gaming in the UK, looking at gamer subjectivities, performativity, and ideologies through an oral history lens. Imo's research interests also include the intersection of the alt-right and gaming spaces. Each of our speakers will talk for approximately 15 minutes, followed by a short discussion amongst the panel before we open the floor for the Q&A. If you have questions, you can enter them into the Q&A section of Zoom. The webinar will be recorded, but not the Q&A portion. I now turn over to our first speaker, Ray.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Aaron, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Amazing. Thank you very much. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Ray Jereza. I am calling in from Washington, D.C. It's an interesting time to be living in D.C. And I'm going to talk about a little about the chapter that Catherine Tibaldi and I wrote for this volume, but also talk about how some of the ideas I've had have changed and kind of shifted a bit since that last chapter. So the chapter that we wrote was in response to calls for ethnographers to empathize with far-right adherents, especially within the field of anthropology. And I think that there are a couple of uses of empathy as an approach. So Hochschild talked about scaling the empathy wall in order to understand, what is truly motivating far-right actors. Pasieka talked about liking the unlikable quote unquote other, to point out that there is some othering of far-right actors that occur, and to basically get past that othering, right? And then Teitelbaum, for example, also wrote about embracing an immoral anthropology when doing ethnography with the right, by arguing that really, as an ethnographer, our commitment is to first listen and take seriously our interlocutors. And therefore, that sometimes involves embracing a kind of immoral anthropology. So Kat and I, Catherine Tibaldi, talked about some of the issues of this kind of approach, that centers empathy. So first, it assumes a white researcher as default, a cis male as default. In our chapter, we talk about how academic institutions reproduce this assumption through the Institutional Review Board, for example, in the United States, which approves research projects and is ostensibly concerned with ethics, but really is just concerned with protecting the university legally and is concerned with legal liability, right? The white researchers assumed as default because in these accounts of the need to empathize with far-right actors, people rarely talk about the positionalities of the researcher and talk about the researcher as if they are someone who could simply just kind of, again, like quote unquote, scale this empathy wall and empathize with their interlocutors without regard for, that researcher's racial positionality, their gender identity, et cetera, right? So in the chapter, I talked a little bit about how I was told once by a colleague that far-right actors who are white are not privileged because they are, working class, and this rehearses and reproduces this problematic idea that there's this white grievance that following in the US, the election of Trump, like these people have a right to be upset, and that they are in fact under attack, and that their politics is just in response to being under attack, right? So Kat and I were thinking about these assumptions and seeking to trouble them in this chapter. The other problem with empathy is I think it frames far-right adherence as fundamentally different from us. Even Pasieka's intervention, which is supposed to be criticizing the othering of far-right actors, doesn't quite get at the ways that we are entangled with far-right actors and the broader political context in which we all live. So empathy, I argue, as it has been used, is about making connections across different types of morality, but it is not really concerned with politics as power. So I wrote a short piece for CREX now 2 years ago that proposes an alternative to empathy, which is inheritance. And it's this concept that I got from Elaine Castillo, who is a Filipino-American author. She writes fiction. I was at a book talk she was doing, and I was reading her book. And she was talking about um, the way we orient toward writers of color, right? She was saying that when we read writers of color in the West, we're often asked to think of ourselves as distinct from from those writers rather as mutually constitutive of and constituting each other in the world, right? So she says that the logic of empathy would have us believe, this is a quote, that other people tell stories which are there to make us feel things, right? So applied to far right actors, the logic of empathy would have us believe that far right actors tell certain stories about their lives and share their feelings in ways that make us feel certain things, discomfort, perhaps we feel disgust, perhaps we feel dislike, hatred. But this creates a kind of separation between us and those actors. Under this logic of inheritance, she argues that relations are central. So it involves knowing ourselves as fundamentally made possible by and fundamentally reliant upon other people, both living and dead, right? So I like that line because it gestures towards like this broader history. So it goes beyond the ethnographic encounter itself as a one-on-one sort of encounter where people are grappling with their feelings about disliking or finding abhorrent the views of the people they're talking about, and is more and draws our attention more to the social political context that shapes such interactions in the first place. I also like it because it again, gets us out of this trap of thinking of ourselves as fundamentally distinct from far right actors, as if they live in a completely different world and that world has its own separate logic. And it draws attention to this kind of white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist world in which we live. So, empathy again assumes that far right adherents are distinct from the rest of us, right? As living in this reality that we must scale the empathy wall in order to fully understand. And again, that involves, some element of perhaps like danger for uh, researchers who occupy positions that or positionalities that are under attack under some of these politics, right? It is concerned with things beyond one-on-one ethnographic encounters. And it recognizes inheritance, that we are all situated within this world. So in this world, far-right adherents' beliefs are not surprising. They're not aberrant. They're not uniquely hateful. And it's something that, and we can take these beliefs and these expressions of these political expressions and connect them to larger scale social, political, and economic phenomena that are ultimately animating those feelings. And so it contextualizes far right's adherents' feelings of being under attack. So not simply saying just sit and listen as an ethnographer and try to understand, scale the empathy wall, try to get over your dislike, and see how you both can connect as human beings. But it recognizes that these feelings are social politically situated. So that is basically what I had to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. So we're going to come back around to each speaker when we do the sort of discussion and Q&A. But now I turn to Elsa Bankston Mueller.
Oh, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Amazing. And let's see. Can you still see it? Yeah, super. Good. Thank you. Sorry, technology. Thank you so much for to the organizers for inviting me here today, and thank you to Aaron for chairing this conversation. So today I just want to address the theme of my chapter, share some of the reflections that guided its creation, and also discuss some of the thoughts that have developed since I wrote it. The chapter itself was written during the early stages of my PhD fieldwork, which was specifically a feminist ethnography of the misogynist incel community. That is all finished now, although like the PhD is not really finished, but the thesis is submitted. But in general, my research takes a feminist approach to the community, and I take a particular interest and inspiration from decolonial and Black feminist scholarship when I'm doing this. So this inherently recognizes the political and ethical elements of not just the research topic itself, but also the research process. So one of the things I became particularly interested in was how emotions play a role in this kind of research. So these perspectives have influenced my thinking about how we can use or be attuned to emotions, not just as a personal response, but as a critical tool for understanding the subjects or topic we research, particularly when studying such charged and violent phenomena as the misogynist incel community, or, for example, extremisms in general, the far right, and so on. So this means that the research subjects or topic, for my part, are not just the misogynist incels, but also the targets and other people who are affected by the politics they reproduce. For example, a recent trend in some parts of the study of incels is to forget about how incels actually affect others too, which consequently skews the narratives being produced in some parts of particular academia. I find this problematic, and this is something I wanted to address with this chapter, and something I continue to address in my other research too. So in sum here, the emotions we experience as researchers, not only as academics, but also as people, inevitably influence what we write and how we engage with our research subjects and topic in general. So being critical and reflexive of this, perhaps by using emotions in your research, may help produce more ethical research, as well as care for ourselves and people who are at the receiving end of violence. So the title of my chapter is Emotions in Methodology, Resisting Violent Ideological Structures in the Knowledge Production of Extremisms. This title encapsulates my argument that we need to resist the temptation to ignore emotions in research. If we fail to acknowledge that emotions are present, I mean that we risk not fully addressing the violence embedded in the very phenomenon we study, for example, extremism or misogynist in the community in my case. So one of the central themes of my chapter is addressing the imbalance between the importance placed on objective research versus the subjective experiences. This imbalance is often reproduced in our wider kind of academic and research culture. And I mean that this imbalance inevitably shapes our understanding of extremisms too. So when we work in a field as politically charged as extremism, where concepts like us versus them are constantly in play, I find it a bit strange that we would hold up objectivity as the standard, or the thing we are seeking to do with our research. Extremism is itself a highly politicized category because it exists in contrast to what we see as non-extremism too. And yet, one might still think that objectivity can fully capture the complexities of these ideologies and practices that we are seeing. So I argued that emotions could be essential to understanding these complexities. Recognizing and even engaging with our emotions helps us align more clearly with the political and ethical dimensions of our work. It allows us to care not only about the effects of extremisms on those it targets, but also about how our research affects others. So how our research might perpetuate harm or contribute to deeper understanding. This argument isn't particularly new in the broader feminist or decolonial research traditions, but it hasn't been applied as much in the context of studies of extremisms, for example. There are probably a few reasons for this. For one, extremisms often manipulate emotions, making us worry about the strong pull of emotions and an inclination of thinking perhaps that emotions might be the pull factor. We don't want to move into that or fully lean into that. And as already mentioned, emotions are typically viewed as something to be controlled or minimized in research, perhaps due to a belief that this makes us more biased than when we are not doing that. There's also the widespread belief that emotions are the antithesis of objectivity, which again further deprioritizes the status within academic research. But these latter points become problematic when you're studying something that fundamentally opposes your values or your existence. For example, like the anti-feminist, the male supremacist, the white supremacist ideologies held by many in the community we might study, such as the misogynist incel community or other relating communities or movements in general. So, for example, for me, it's been impossible to not feel my research. So for those of us researching these kind of ideologies, emotions are not just the theoretical concepts, they are part of our lived experiences. We feel the weight of the research every day, not just as scholars, but as individuals as we encounter these harms elsewhere, not just in our studies. So the idea that we should somehow separate our roles as researchers from our personal responses can become harmful in itself. And dismissing our emotions as irrelevant misses the point that feelings are intertwined with how we make sense of and respond to and engage with the world in general, and particularly also how we engage with violence. So emotion should not be seen merely as something that can cloud our judgment or as a distraction from the real research. However, we should definitely be critical to our emotions. Here, I'm particularly thinking, for example, how defensiveness as whiteness and vice versa can be a very potential obstructionist to and harm in our research, for example, or responses to being accused of racism, for example, emotions can then be a powerful tool for understanding the impacts of extremism, but also beyond extremisms. So not just how it impacts the individual that is directly involved in this, but also on the wider political structures that allow these ideologies to flourish, including our research processes and what we encounter there. I think is important to address. So critically thinking about the ethical and political of my research has helped me being attuned to emotions have been crucial actually in the development of my research. For example, one important aspect of researching misogynist incels is to not be completely focused on individuals, but also incorporate the role of structures and enablers in making the community. So when we solely focus on extremists or misogynist incels as isolated actors, for example, we miss the larger picture, so the very structures of power that enable their growth. For example, reflecting on my chapter, when I reread it, I discussed the concept of the black pill. So in a belief system embraced by many misogynist incels, initially, I framed the black pill as an ideology in its own right, but upon further reflection, I've come to believe that it's not really an ideology in itself. So the black pill I think, is better understood as a new kind of symbolism, a manifestation of deeper, more entrenched power structures, like borrowing from bell hooks and others, a manifestation of imperial white supremacist capitalism, cis heteropatriarchy. So this shift in understanding is important, I think, because the black pill as a concept or symbol doesn't exist in a vacuum. So emphasizing that it is an ideology, for example, like we are seeing that the spread of incel ideology I think can rather upkeep a misogynist ideology and serve as a distraction from actually going into the bottom of what is producing misogynist incels or the misogynist incel ideology. Instead, it's important to emphasize that it's part of a larger network of oppressive systems. So these systems shape not just the incels who adhere to these beliefs, but also the broader cultural and political environment that allows such groups and ideas to thrive. So what I've realized over time is that it's not just about understanding the incel community as a subculture in isolation, it's about understanding how misogyny operates more broadly in our society, and thus understanding the enablers that are involved in making a misogynist incel community. So seeing the overlapping expressions of misogyny from this community to other parts of everyday has helped in this formation, and tuning into the emotions around this, my reaction to the everyday has been helpful in this sense. So in conclusion, I want to stress that the study of extremism or misogynist incels, particularly in relation to misogyny and feminism, requires us to take emotions seriously, both in our research and in our reflections on that research. Recognizing and using emotions allows us to better understand not just the ideologies we study, but the very politics of knowledge production itself. It helps us understand how research can either contribute to or resist harmful ideologies, and it encourages us to think critically about the impact of our work on the world around us. And I also just want to stress that this is still a very much work in progress. I'm still reflecting a lot on this, on emotions and methodology in general, and the politics and ethics around it all. And I'm happy to clarify anything that needs clarifying if I can later. I'm also very keen on collaborating in general about this kind of research aspects on the emotions and these particular topics. So if anyone feels inclined to do that together, please do reach out. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Elsa. So our next speaker is Emo Kaufman.
Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes.
There
we go.
Right. Cool. Can you see my?
Yes, we can.
Fab. Okay, let me know if the slides don't change for any reason or anything. Cool. So thank you very much for inviting me here today. Sorry about being a tiny bit Zoom incompetent. So I kind of wrote this as a very reflective piece on my chapter, and I am due to hand in my thesis in 7 days, so that might partly explain the kind of narrative that emerges here, which I think will become apparent. So I wrote my book chapter, Safety and Silence, Oral History, Far-Right Research and the Paradox of the Vocal Minority, near the beginning of my PhD, and I'm set to hand it in 8 days next Friday. And it's been very interesting to reflect on the chapter I wrote, what has changed and what hasn't. I enter far-right studies through my primary discipline and the focus of my thesis research, game studies. But I don't study video games themselves, I study gaming culture, people who play video games, gamer identity, and how all these things matter, not just within the context of gameplay and gaming communities, but beyond the screen. Today, I want to reflect on what this chapter meant to me then and what it means to me now. And to start, I want to take you back before my PhD. I had just finished my master's and was curious about doing a PhD project that looked at the problem of gaming's relationship with far-right ideologies. I'd gone to speak with a professor at university, told her about my ideas and given her my pitch, and she took issue with it, or perhaps with me. She told me my project idea was flawed because I had already decided the problem existed, the problem between the far right and gaming. Safe to say, I never returned to that particular university or scholar and ended up based elsewhere. But at the time this experience knocked my confidence, it made me doubt not just my ideas but my own experiences. I'm a Jew, and almost all the anti-Semitism I have experienced has been from nerdy people, often nerdy men, in proximity to video games. Gaming, or rather gamers, and anti-Semitism have always been intimately connected for me. So the idea that I had already decided there was a link between gaming and the far right was frankly ridiculous, and I have the confidence to see that now. The relationship was already decided, but not by myself. This is one of the ways academia's deployment of objectivity inherently erodes lived experience. This was also another paradox. I could not research gaming in the far right because I had already decided the problem exists. I could not research gaming in the far right because even though I know acutely through my own lived experiences that the problem does exist, that was also a problem. And within my work, I do not try to deny that my research is personal to me or argue that because I have experienced it, I know everything. Rather, I seek to finitely stake my positionality in my research, how it affects what I do and how I do it. In this presentation, I want to consider what has changed since I wrote this chapter, how anti-Semitism and the way the word is used has changed, how the far right and its relationship with video game culture has changed, and how I, a researcher, have changed, and why this matters. I feel like at this moment, when talking about anti-Semitism, it is important to identify legitimate anti-Semitism versus the anti-Semitism a lot of mainstream media and far-right figures and groups are outcrying. Anti-Semitism as a term is now being deployed to justify all manner of things, including workplace terminations, cracking down on protesters and free speech, universities persecuting their own students, violence and genocide. Whilst anti-Semitism is a real, live issue, here I'm referencing it being applied incorrectly or disingenuously. Anti-Semitism is now being used by the far right and far right adjacent figures in a completely paradoxical operation. For the far right do not care about Jews, they only care about them as far as they are useful in justifying violence and genocide against Palestinians. And furthermore, the conflation of Jews with the state of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic in turn, ignoring the fact that many Jewish people do not support Israel's actions and are themselves protesting violence and arms sales to Israel. I hope it goes without saying as well that disingenuous weaponizations of anti-Semitism make it harder to identify and call out real anti-Semitism, and in fact make Jews less safe. Beyond my thesis, in another publication, I've written about the specific problem of anti-Semitism in game studies research, and I still remember the feedback reviewer 1 gave me on that article. He told me that my paper, which did not use the phrase white man or white men once, was an attack on white male positionality. I can only speculate why reviewer 1 wrote this, but I suspect it is because I criticized the supposed objectivity of game scholars and how discussing intergenerational traumatic events like the Holocaust without examining your own subjectivity can be harmful in of itself. But this comment from reviewer 1 is evocative of something else, how the far right, or even just people who can benefit within far right frameworks, or at least benefit more than explicitly minoritized groups, can react when you challenge the systematic privileges that uphold white supremacy and far right beliefs, how challenging harmful ideas or frameworks, or even just the way things are currently done, can be seen as an attack. Or rather, the framing of it as an attack makes it easier to counteract. Here is yet another paradox the far right operate through, weaponizing the language of left-wing movements and identity politics to justify their beliefs and actions. This weaponization is of a similar vein to the vocal minority I wrote about in my chapter, how gamers minoritize themselves through language they and others repeat about them. When I write about the term vocal minority in games culture, I'm talking about people who play video games, often referred to as gamers, who are perceived as being toxic about them, for example, harassing others in online games or assuming first-person shooters are the only proper type of video game. In my research, interview participants would often bring up the vocal minority in an effort to acknowledge what was bad or difficult about games culture. However, intentionally or not, the term vocal minority simultaneously works to legitimize white men's fears about being minoritized within gaming, even though this has not happened yet and is unlikely ever to, whilst delegitimizing their arguments and presence in game space. The vocal minority have not been spoken or ignored out of existence since I interviewed my participants, despite their significance often being played down in interviews. In fact, the prevalence of online masculinity content, or the manosphere, which has deep connections to gaming communities, is worsening and becoming more emboldened and more mainstream. Now, in the spirit of my original chapter, where I explored a segment of a Louis Theroux documentary where he visits a Nazi in his own home, I want to return to Louis Theroux and his more recent piece, Forbidden America, Extreme and Online. During the documentary, Theroux attends AFPAC, the America First Political Action Conference created and hosted by Nick Fuentes. Fuentes is an online far-right figure and streamer who propagates conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement and has extreme anti-Semitic, racist, misogynistic views. And Louis has the following exchange when talking with one of the attendees at the conference. He tells him, "You seem young at the moment. Are you at university?" And the attendee replies, "I am." "You're a student?" "That's correct." And then the student goes on to tell Louis, it's important to get young people politically engaged to control not only the direction that the country is headed in as a whole, but especially the direction that the conservative movement is headed in. And then Louis asks a question seemingly out of nowhere. He says, are you a gamer? Is that part of what's going on as well? And the student replies that generally that's something that would fit into the personality of a lot of the attendees of this conference. I think, we generally like to game a little bit of, Fortnite, Call of Duty here and there. And another attendee straight after this exchange tells Louis he connected with Nick Fuentes because they used to play Fortnite together. Gaming is not just something conference attendees happen to do, but it's the glue that sticks them together. A lot of my research is about gamer identity, how it has all these different meanings attached to it, some of them being innocuous, like a gamer is someone who likes to play games, and some of them being more intentional, like a gamer is someone who's toxic or abusive, or gamers are young white men who harass people, often game developers online. When the attendee tells Louis we generally like to game a little bit, this is a loaded phrase that signals to deeper connections between far-right ideologies and gaming culture. Whilst it is about gaming, it is also about all the other things attached to gaming and gamer identity. Whiteness, masculinity, the performative prowess of play, and the connective possibilities of video games. I bring up this clip, however, not just to demonstrate the relationship between gaming and the far right, but to discuss how it made me feel. I cannot tell you how excited I was when Louis asked this question, how strongly I reacted. It might seem odd to be excited as a Jew watching a documentary about Nazis, fascists, and young men who game and align with them, but I was. As I discussed in my chapter, I enjoy my research, and I still really do. For whatever reason, young men and gamers who are drawn into far-right belief systems fascinate me, and I enjoy researching them. The fact that I enjoy the work, even when it's hard or upsetting, feels really important. And I think I enjoy it because it's something I'm passionate about and something that matters to me. As a Jewish queer person, I'm inherently threatened by far-right ideologies, but I also play video games, and I'm invested in them too, and making them safe and accessible for everyone. At times, my research has made me angry, upset, and even despondent. I think all these emotions, understanding them and sitting with them, are integral to the research process. Within my thesis, I use a lot of affect feminist frameworks, primarily that of Sarah Ahmed's, and when I write about the interview data I collected, I often talk about emotion, the emotions interview participants describe, anticipate, and felt. When writing on the far right in gaming, emotions are key to untangling the ideological knots that toxic gamers entangle themselves up within. In other words, their beliefs are not rational or logical, and can only truly be understood through feeling. The feeling of being under attack, of being justified, of being owed something, the feeling that something you love or enjoy is going to be taken away. Whilst not always and often not legitimate, their feelings are real in that they are felt deeply and sincerely. For myself as a researcher, understanding how to analyze, write about, and contend with their emotions, a gamer's righteous anger or his entitlement, first required I deeply feel and understand my own. This is antithetical to the attitude I first encountered when considering a PhD, when a university professor told me my research was problematic, or rather that I was the problem because I had already noticed another problem existed. To conclude, I want to briefly return to the argument I made in this book chapter. I argued that I found power through the paradox of far-right hatred, that whilst fascists have violent thoughts towards me, or rather the idea of me, they also perpetually anticipate me, the Jew, the attack, or the disturbance I might bring. Or perhaps more specifically, the attack on white male positionality. I argued that I, a Jew, can find power in this paradox, in the liminal spaces Jews often occupy, as potentially enfeebled, sneaky, and yet powerful enough to sway geopolitical issues or even bring about the end of the white race. That I can find power in being perpetually anticipated without having to arrive or appear. I wrote that when considering my decision to not interview the far right directly, maybe as I turn away from spaces that might harm me, I do not enter non-space but carve new space and new possibility. And I believe this is still true, but I also understand that I can never fully extricate myself from spaces that might harm me, especially in a research context. A part of sitting with my emotions and moving through them, a part of moving through the paradox that is researching a movement that inherently exists to do you harm, is accepting that you cannot entirely escape those spaces or ideas because they relate to your body and your body's welfare, safety, and happiness. Accepting this and understanding how it makes me feel and how those feelings in turn affected my work felt integral to the research process and to engaging reflexively with my positionality as a researcher and understanding how I affected the work and how the work affected me. Thank you for listening. That's my cats. Just something cheerful.
Thank you very much.